Hey, this is four-time Black Belt World Champion Dominica Obelenite. If you guys are looking to level up your Jiu-Jitsu game with awesome Jiu-Jitsu courses on mindset, strategy, and beyond, make sure that you guys check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. I myself have a course up there, so make sure you guys check it out. Let's get you guys on that next step in your Jiu-Jitsu journey.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 208. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and I'm happy to be joined again by Mr. Robert Degle. Robert, how's it going, man?
Good. I'm just here in Singapore. Woke up drinking my kopi o, which is local for coffee with no sugar.
Great way to start the morning, right? You know, you wake up, you roll out of bed, get your coffee in, and then immediately just begin podcasting.
Yeah, good start to a Saturday.
Absolutely. And I mean, I got some bad news for the listeners. The topic du jour today here is not Star Wars related, which I know is going to disappoint a lot of people.
Maybe in the future we'll come back to Star Wars. But
yeah, well, you know, it's a well that never runs dry. I got to admit, I am a little bit salty because, I put a lot of time and effort into putting this thing together, right? And I polled people recently about what is their favorite episode ever that we've ever done. And by far, the runaway number one choice was Degle defends the Star Wars prequels.
That's awesome. Holy shit. I love that. I'm honored.
I think I might have missed my calling here with this podcast. I think we might need to do like a hard pivot into media analysis or something, because clearly that's where the clicks are. But anyway, so there you go.
The reason why, my guess, that it became the number one is because it's such an outlier overall that it really stands out. And the people that are like that are really going to like it. I'm sure like 75% of the audience did not watch it. But those that did really liked it. So that's my guess.
I think you're exactly right. I think that, this is the challenge we struggle with as we're putting this thing together. When we get guys like you on the podcast, it's hard to pick a unique topic because you guys share so much information. I mean, how can I, when I'm talking to someone like you, how can I attack this and get a new subject out when you spend so much time making stuff out there? How can I find something new? And I got to say, like, talking to jiu-jitsu people about the Star Wars prequels is a very unique and novel topic that hasn't been done to death yet.
Yeah. But anyway, so let's start on one of the topics we were going to discuss today.
Yeah, let's do it. Which one do you want to do first? So we had a few ideas, but they're all kind of thematically related. So I'll turn it over to you. And why don't you kick this off?
Yeah, so the first topic, like the initial topic that I wanted to talk about was about like basically a discussion of what is stalling. And when I say what is stalling, I want to be like very clear, like the word stalling, just like any other, word with some degree of ambiguity, can be used to describe any number of possible things, right? Like that's providing like a definition of the word stalling isn't very interesting to me. In fact, I would argue it's like borderline, not even borderline. I'd say it's impossible, right? We're not here to do that, okay? What I want to do is instead I want to take a look at how we can look at what stalling is. Maybe we don't have a perfect definition that encapsulates all possible meaningful definitions of what stalling might be on like a universal level, but we have a good enough grasp of the concept that we can then use it to meaningfully structure rule sets, right? Because ultimately, if jiu-jitsu is a sport, which it obviously is, right? It's important that when we say that something within the sport is stalling, that there's some meaning behind that refs can enforce with objectivity or a measure of objectivity that goes beyond just like complete ambiguity and ref favoritism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that's probably, like you said, it's a tricky thing to pin down. Reminds me of the discussion about base. Everyone in jiu-jitsu talks about base all the time, but if you sit someone down and say, can you actually explain to me what that is? It's kind of a bit of a mind fuck for a lot of people because we take these ideas for granted. And stalling is another example of that too. I mean, everyone, I think, intuitively probably thinks they know what stalling is. But if you were to ask someone to really explain it, it gets a bit harder. Like it's not as simple as, well, this guy's not moving. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you might not be moving that have absolutely nothing to do with stalling. The most notable being you can't move because your opponent is tying you up, right?
Yeah. And so what is happening there when people feel like, oh, I know what stalling is that in a sense, they in fact do. So, okay, let's take it back a little bit and get kind of like, I'll briefly discuss some like philosophy around language. So like for most of the history of Western philosophy, when people were looking at like a concept such as like stalling or what is justice or whatever, what they were looking for was essential underlying qualities that they could use to identify all given instances of that, quality that they were looking for, right? So in Plato, for instance, you see this in the theory of the forms, right? So the theory of the forms is that for every given object in the world, there is a perfect form of that object that has all the base essential qualities of that object. So you could say the form of a chair exists in the world of the forms. And if one could identify the form of chairs, one could identify all things as being chairs, right? And at first you go, okay, I obviously know what a chair is, right? But then you say, okay, what if there's like a rock and you're sitting on it? It's like, is that a chair? It's like, well, it kind of is, but it kind of isn't. And then later in philosophy, a way of looking at language that I like much more was proposed by Ludwig Wittgenstein, where he analyzed this sort of like essentializing view of definitions. And he found it really lacking because, for instance, like when we talk about something like stalling and there's ambiguity, it's so hard to have this like perfect formal definition that applies to all cases. What he instead said was he offers two sort of side-by-side suggestions to look at definitions. The first is that he doesn't want you to look for underlying essential qualities, but rather uses in language. So he famously said, the meaning of a word is its use in language. So for instance, when I say, this is going to sound kind of strange, but if you think about it, it starts to make a lot of sense. The word blue, am I pointing to essential qualities of, if I point to a blue car, am I pointing to essential underlying qualities of that blue car? You might think so, but actually on a level of like communication, if I'm speaking to another person and I say, that's a blue car, and you say, yes, I see it. I see that also as a blue car, right? Like what's happening there, it's not so much about universal truth, but rather more so the capacity the word in the sentence offers us to communicate effectively, right? So getting very like abstract here. The other thing that Wittgenstein spoke about was family resemblance. So when we have a concept such as, let's say, stalling, right? Don't think of it as being, oh, all instances of stalling are exactly the same, and therefore they share the same underlying qualities. Rather, it's more something like members of a family who each have a similar feature with another member of the family. And if you can imagine like like a Venn diagram, right? With like 8 circles, right? Going down a line. Perhaps the one on the farthest left and the one on the farthest right, they don't really have anything in common per se, right? But as it goes down the line, you find that each person connecting to the other has something in common with the previous and then the next in the chain, right? And so that's the notion of family resemblance. And basically, like, I think when people think of stalling, okay, they understand because they've been trained in the use of the English language, how people use that word in language. They've identified examples. They've seen examples of how it's used in language. And that example is somewhere along the chain of family resemblances of possible uses of the word of stalling, possible coherent uses of the word stalling. And the trick is we aren't just looking for a possible coherent use of the word stalling, right? So for instance, I want to talk about the Kanan Duarte Craig Jones match. If you watch that match and you say Kanan is stalling, you could say that, but the question is what Kanan did there an extraordinary example of stalling that requires some like rule change such that the negatives he got were like justified, right? So I'm gonna argue like no, I think the negatives he got were kind of insane. but
Yeah, 100%. It probably a good time to remind people if they're not familiar with your stuff that your background in addition to jiu-jitsu is philosophy, which is why you know all of this stuff. But yeah, I agree with you that I think a lot of what you're saying is that when you're talking about how we use language, it's not just about what the word technically means in the dictionary, but also kind of how we intuitively understand and figure out what the other people are trying to say and imply, right? Like language is kind of fluid in a lot of ways, and sometimes words can have slightly different meaning, but human beings are good at figuring out patterns and stuff, so we can often figure it out, right? If you say stalling, I might not have the exact same definition of you as to what that means, but we can kind of at least understand what each other is talking about. Is that kind of the route that you're going here?
yeah. So for instance, think of how a child learns a language. You don't put a child in front of a dictionary and have them read every word, and then that's how they learn what those words mean. Child's, it's early in the morning. Children learn languages. I'm talking about language while I pronounce words incorrectly anyway. So like children learn languages they acquire them through like immersion and experience, right? Like they see how words are used in everyday language in order to forward the goals of the user of the word, right? So that's how that's one way we can view language as being acquired, right? Yeah. So this is all so when I was doing philosophy, I was very interested in Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is all like Wittgensteinian stuff. And if anyone's interested in this type of exploring this type of thought regarding meaning, they could just look up Ludwig Wittgenstein, specifically the later stuff, though I think you should probably start with the earlier stuff to get a baseline. But anyway, so to bring it back to the specific jiu-jitsu topic, okay, we have an idea of how we want to approach this topic of asking what is stalling in jiu-jitsu. Before we talk about stalling, let's talk about what I think the opposite of stalling is, which is engagement, okay? Stalling, on a general level, we can kind of think of as it's a way in which we can inhibit engagement. Engagement also being kind of difficult to define, but let's just broadly categorize it as doing jiu-jitsu, more or less, right? When you're engaging in a jiu-jitsu match, it's a jiu-jitsu match. If you're engaging, you're hopefully doing jiu-jitsu, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, without getting too intricate with it, right? So engagement, to me, doing jiu-jitsu, to me, when I think of it, I think of if you look at someone, is what they're doing jiu-jitsu in terms of do they have to have skill to be doing it, right? So for instance, an escape from a pin, that takes skill, right? You can't just that's not just doing nothing, right? Whereas just lying flat on your back, is that jiu-jitsu? No, it's not jiu-jitsu. You're just doing nothing, right? You're not expressing any skill in lying flat on your back, right? Maybe temporarily, and then you use that to bait them to do something, and then bang, you pop up, right? That I could see that, but for extended periods of time, if you're just lying there, that's not jiu-jitsu. Similarly, if you're on top of somebody and you're holding them down and they're trying to get out, that takes skill. That's jiu-jitsu skill, right? Holding someone down isn't just nothing, right? There's a continuous stream of effort that has to be put forth in order to hold someone down, provided, even if they do suck, to be honest. I was going to say provided they're good, but even if they suck, you still need to apply pressure in the proper places. You need to put wedges in certain spots, right? So yeah, even if they suck, you're still expressing skill. Maybe less, but you still are expressing a certain degree of it, right? So engagement is, to me, what we want our rule set ultimately to encourage. We want the rule set to encourage the active engagement of the athletes. And the measure of that I am suggesting is the degree to which what you are doing requires the expression of jiu-jitsu skill. And then obviously, of course, you could attack this and say, what does that mean? What does jiu-jitsu skill mean? I think that's where we have to sort of stop with the intellectual analysis and kind of just look at what we're doing, right? And, when you watch a jiu-jitsu match, if you are a practitioner of jiu-jitsu, it's kind of obvious, I think, when someone is doing something that requires skill, as long as you've trained for a decent amount of time, right? Like when you see someone and they're mounted and they fight to get out, like, you know that was hard, right? If you see someone and they're mounted and they just lie flat on their back, well, you know that that's relatively easy by comparison. You know, I mean, it sucks. They're in mount. Nobody wants to be in mount, but fighting to get out is a lot harder than just lying flat on your back, right? Because one takes physical effort, and more so than anything else, the expression of skill, which to me expresses you're engaging, and therefore you're not stalling. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think what's tricky about stalling when it comes to how we explain and put this into practice is it's a harder rule to enforce fairly than things that are much more obvious and mechanical. I mean, if we want to, for example, reward points for knee on belly, we can kind of broadly define what knee on belly means and where your body needs to be positioned. And if that box gets checked, so be it, we award the points. Stalling is a little bit trickier because there is a degree of intent that has to be implied, right? Just because I'm not moving, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm stalling. There's a variety of reasons why, like I said, that could be the case, whether it be maybe strategically, if I'm in a dominant position, me pinning you is the smartest thing for me to do. Or maybe you've got me controlled and I simply can't move. I'm trying to, but I just can't. Or maybe it's a strategic thing and it's not that I'm trying to necessarily stall, but I'm trying to pit stop and grind you down or just throw off your rhythm. There can be a lot of reasons why someone might cease movement or forward progression without necessarily in their head trying to stall. So it's a tricky one for a referee to call because they've kind of got to guess at what the person's intent is. And that's why I think this one kind of gets debated a lot more. You know, it's a lot easier to kind of go down a rabbit hole and debate something like this where the referee's job is to guess the player's intent. That can be a lot harder than something that's purely mechanical where you can see with your own two eyes exactly what's happening and most people are going to agree on what happened, right? Stalling is much more internal in terms of what's going on in the player's head.
I don't fully agree with what you just said because I do think you can identify there are certain mechanical cues, I think, as to situations to determine whether someone's stalling or not, right? But I do agree that intent does matter, but I think more so on a big picture scale in terms of I don't think that as a community we have ever or maybe will ever agree on what the point of the sport is, right? Some people are like, oh, it's the submission is all that matters. If you don't get the submission, if you didn't submit me, you didn't really win, which is, I think, a kind of a dumb way to look at it. But some people do think that, right? And some people are like, well, the point of the sport is to simulate a real fight, blah, blah, blah. So there's 100 different ways to view what is the point of the sport. So that's, I think, where the intent side comes in. But in terms of the ref officiating the match, right? So let me tell you where I think that this impulse to call stalling comes from. I think there's two really big examples of stuff that people call stalling in sport jiu-jitsu. The first, I would agree, is stalling. It's when someone's on top and they're backing away for most of the match, especially in ADCC, and then over time they just wrestle, right? I would say that is stalling because if you're backing away and you have no intent to engage, yeah, you're not doing, that's not jujitsu, right? You need to be engaging. In a jujitsu match, you need to be engaging, right? And if anyone says, but ADCC is not a jiu-jitsu tournament, submission wrestling, at this point, they're the same thing. Anyway, so the other type of stalling would be, and this I don't think this is stalling, is let's say I pass your guard in side control and you're trying to get out and I'm holding you down. That's not stalling. I don't think that's stalling because if you've ever trained or competed against someone your own skill level, it's fucking hard to hold people down. It's just not this idea that, oh, they're just holding them down and choosing not to advance. It's such an overly simplistic way of looking at things. You don't know, maybe when I passed this guy's guard, I'm holding them down. And I feel like if I make any movements, they're going to get out. And the question is, okay, the question then becomes, whose responsibility is it in that situation? I passed their guard, right? I'm holding them down. Is it my responsibility now to take further risks such that I maybe let the guy out? Or is it the responsibility of the guy who got his fucking guard passed to do something to get out? I think that the responsibility to move forward another step shouldn't be on the person who's already taken the first step to move forward, regardless of whether that's top or bottom. Because again, I keep coming back to this because it's to me, it's all about engagement. Who is engaging? Hopefully they're both engaging, right? But if they're both engaging, then there's no stalling happening. So like, unfortunately, a lot of people don't want to deal with this or accept this. A lot of high-level jiu-jitsu is boring as fuck. And that's just kind of part of it. You know, not every match is going to be Gary Tonin versus Husamar Palhares. Like, those are outliers. Most matches are going to be like Joao Miao versus Tomoyuki Hashimoto or Gunnar Nelson versus Jeff Munson. If you've never seen those two matches, go watch them. That's what most high-level matches look like. And they're interesting, but also like, you know, it's kind of boring too, right? So because you have two guys that are really good squaring off against each other, and of course they're going to negate a lot of what each other is doing, right? Because they're both really good. So
yeah, there's some good observations there. And I should clarify too, there's different types of stalling. The type of stalling I was referring to was more when someone is just not moving. But there's different types. Like you said, if someone is actively disengaging and trying to avoid the fight, it's a lot easier to call that. I mean, what is it? Caleb Starnes versus Nate Quarry comes to mind, where one person is literally actively running the entire fight, right? At that point, you can safely project. But there's a point where not moving becomes a strategic decision. And I agree with you. I've always found this to be an odd thing about the way that some jiu-jitsu rule sets score. I found it strange that if you are the person in the dominant position, that in some rule sets, the onus is on you to keep advancing. And that doesn't, I mean, I get why from a spectator friendliness standpoint, someone might think, okay, we got to put this rule in because we want to please the fans. But from a, why do we do this standpoint, I've always thought that, if the idea, and again, we're kind of getting philosophical here, but the thing about jiu-jitsu that is kind of one of its fundamental things in a lot of ways is positional control. And sometimes, like you said, sometimes you've got a position just by the hair, and you know that if you move just an inch left or right, the person's going to get out. And if that's the case, it is not in your best interests to throw all of that away. And that only becomes more important as your opponents get more and more skilled and high level, right? You can afford to make very little mistakes against a good person. And I do think that, if jiu-jitsu is intended to be about positional advancement and such, it should not really be the onus of a person who's already controlling the fight to control it better. We should think it should be the onus of the person who is losing to do something about that, right? There should be a sense of urgency for the person who's losing to get out and to move. So it does seem kind of odd that some rule sets would punish the person who's already winning if they decide to just keep winning the way that they were already winning, right? Strategically, it's an odd thing.
Yeah, no, I'm in complete agreement with you. Yeah. And I think you're spot on with it. I think it comes from this desire to like make jiu-jitsu a spectator sport. And like I've argued in the past on like, I think on this podcast and on other podcasts too, that's kind of like, it's sort of a bad goal. I know that sounds strange to people, but like, the question is like, do we care more about the integrity of the art, or do we want this to be an expression of like competent grappling first and foremost, or is our priority on it being a spectacle? You know what I mean? It can sometimes be both, and that's awesome. But if we ever have to choose between the two, like, geez, I hope we choose that jiu-jitsu should be an expression of competent grappling, right? Like over spectacle, right? Like, because if you guys know the history of catch wrestling was once a legitimate sport, but it started to get boring for the fans. So what did they do? They're like, oh, let's just script the outcomes and just start doing backflips. And now we have the WWE.
Hey, nothing against the WWE, but you're right. It has turned into a performance environment because the focus has been on creating a show, which is, from a financial standpoint, totally understandable. But at the end of the day, then you start to deviate away from what made the sport the sport.
Yeah. And 100%, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like I like the WWE. It's fun. I'm not like a hardcore fan, but like it is definitely fun. Like I've watched it and I will probably watch it again, right? But the thing is like, like I got into jiu-jitsu not because like I thought that flying triangles were cool, although I did think they were cool. I got into jiu-jitsu because I was like, I want to learn how to effectively control people on the ground, and that pursuit is really, really fun, and like, and yeah, maybe it's not the most entertaining thing to the fans, but does it always have to be? Like, I never hear like fans of like elite wrestling go, yeah, that guy won the gold at the Olympics, but did he do enough lat drops? Like, you know what I mean? Like, nobody says that. They just go, oh, wow, he fucking won Olympic gold. That guy is elite.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm sure that, in other sports, hey, a good, exciting game is always going to get more fan attention than one where not much happens. But yeah, you're right that generally people seem to be a lot harder on jiu-jitsu athletes and MMA fighters as well when it comes to expecting a performance out of people. And that, I mean, again, it's understandable. And as a financial incentive, you totally get why the people setting up these tournaments would want to make things more interesting. But I mean, look, when it comes to effective combat, interesting is not always better. I've talked on the podcast a few times with Rob Bernacki and some others. Like, in a lot of ways, especially as you get older, part of your job as a combat athlete is to make the fight as uninteresting as possible, right? You want to take away variability. You want to make the fight predictable so that you don't get caught off guard by something crazy. And a lot of the time, that means constricting your opponent's options until there's not much left for them to do. And if that means sitting on the ground and pinning them for 5 minutes, like, so be it. That's good jiu-jitsu. But yeah, the rules are not always aligned with that at the moment. And that's an interesting area where the commercial side of the sport, I think, is kind of diverging from the reason the sport was created in the first place. And it's hard to say if there's a right or a wrong answer. But yeah, I agree with you that I don't know if everyone will ever come to a consensus about what the right answer is.
Yeah. I mean, so what I think is a really good compromise here is that we can have a balance between like the spectacle and like the integrity of the sport, so to speak. So you've got super fight shows like Polaris and Who's Number One and Kasai. I heard they're coming back. I hope that rumor's true. And like, you can have these super fight shows, and if you want the priority on those shows to be crazy spectacle shit, bro, I'm fine with that. That's an area for that, right? But when we're talking about ADCC, IBJJF, other elite tournaments like Naga, we want things to stay. I hope everybody knows that was a joke. All right. So like, we want things to stay like about the sport, right? When I watch ADCC finals, my priority isn't how many backflips did the guy do before he got the win, right? I want to watch the match and just see what worked to win. That is the only thing that I care about. If somebody gets a submission, that's fucking awesome. But in ADCC finals, that is extremely rare. You're not going to see that very much. And there's no rule changes. There's no amount of negative points you give to people for pinning people that's going to like, magically increase the number of submissions. And I wouldn't even, and even if you could, it would destroy the integrity of the sport. And it would become about like flying triangles and arm bars and just like, I want to see what works. I don't care if it's flashy. I just want to see what works. And of course you can say, okay, most people don't. Well, then I just think those people don't like jiu-jitsu. Like, like that jiu-jitsu isn't always flashy, right? Sometimes it's slow and it's boring. I remember I said on a previous podcast of yours, I said like good jiu-jitsu is a lot of the time it's very patient, right? Like as you develop in like maturity in your grappling, I think what you come to realize is that like you can't always get what you want whenever you want it, even if you're better than the person. Sometimes it's going to take time. You have to be patient, and you shouldn't be punished for being patient.
Yeah, I agree. In a lot of ways, you're punishing people for good strategy, right? You're rewarding the performance and the watchability aspect over the effectiveness of the art. And I would even argue that whether, flashy dynamic stuff is more watchable and more entertaining, I would argue that honestly. I mean, I enjoy watching a very, very slow, deliberate, well-paced, but very conservative match where you've got two people who are being very, very careful because they respect the effectiveness of their opponent. I don't need to see people just running around and doing backflips and doing crazy stuff. I think there's something cool about the tension of like a 0-0 match where just both people are just really, really good at shutting down and nullifying the other person. It's one of my favorite matches of all time was when Mackenzie Dern beat Gabby Garcia. That match was like, it ended with a 0-0 score where Mackenzie won. I love that match, and it was tense as hell. I mean, there wasn't a lot of crazy stuff happening in it, but just that ability to shut down and nullify someone, I find very entertaining. And, it's interesting because you look at MMA, right? I mean, I think a lot of the people who want to see flashy stuff in jiu-jitsu, like you said, we're probably never going to win them over. They'd probably be better suited watching MMA anyway. But even in MMA, I think the fans have gotten more educated there too. There was a time when as soon as the fight went to the ground, the fans would just boo like a Pavlovian response. But now when it goes to the ground, people cheer and they get excited and they understand dilemmas and positions, and they understand when one person's in trouble and they get excited about it. So I think fan behavior can be trained as well. Fans can be educated, and maybe that's a different approach over trying to fuck with the rule set.
Yeah, for sure. It'll be interesting to see come next ADCC where this sort of conversation goes. So for instance, at the last ADCC, off the top of my head, the match that I was most excited by mid-match was probably PJ Barch versus JT Torres. I mean, that was when PJ hit that double, I was fucking losing my shit. As a fan of, not even because I was rooting for PJ per se, I'm a fan of both of them. I didn't really have a dog in that fight. But for PJ to do that to JT is insane. And it's it was so hype because of the expression of skill. You know what I mean? It wasn't hype because of some silly, I don't know, cartwheel, backflip, whatever thing, right? It was just fucking insane because to do that against JT at that level is just an absurd expression of skill. Another one was actually Barch versus Cade. That was another one where it was so many fucking moments in that match that were Jesus Christ, this is so high level. But yeah. Anyway, so yeah, I feel like I've said everything I wanted to say on this. For me, where this conversation came from really was the Kaynan Duarte Craig Jones match, where I did have a dog in that fight. I was rooting for Craig, obviously. But that being said, I was just I was shocked at how many negatives they gave Kaynan. I mean, it was and I think Craig even agreed. I think after the match, he even said that. It's I've never seen, I've watched, obviously I wasn't watching them live, but I've watched pretty much every ADCC, right? Maybe not every match that's ever happened, of course, but I've watched a lot, okay? And I can't recall ever having seen that many negatives given in a match. And to be perfectly clear, Kaynan passed his guard and mounted him versus a really good example is Gunnar Nelson versus Jeff Monson. Go watch this match and ask me who is stalling more, Kaynan in the match versus Craig or Jeff in the match versus Gunnar. It's it's so obvious who's stalling more. And the negatives they gave to Kaynan, I've never seen anything like that. There's no consistent precedent for that I'm aware of, right? And so then I have to ask myself, if you're in an ADCC match, how do you guarantee that you don't get stalling goals? You just literally have to never stop. You can't take breaks. If you pass someone's guard and you mount them and you don't submit them within 15 seconds, I guess you have to dismount. I don't know. That was where this sort of desire to have this conversation came from, because it's yeah, I wanted to see Craig win, but at the same time, I also, more than wanting to see any one person win, I want to see the sport have integrity. Yeah, I don't understand on what grounds they could have justified giving Kaynan that many negatives.
Yeah, I think the trick, like we were talking about, the thing about stalling is it's a bit trickier to call consistently than things like, hey, you're in this position. That kind of stuff is much more visible, whereas stalling requires a bit of interpretation. And I think that can be a problem because it makes the referee's job inconsistent. And that's incredibly hard and honestly unfair for the athlete, right? An athlete needs to go in there knowing that they're going to be playing under consistent rules all the time. And this does, you see this a lot in MMA as well, right? Where just for whatever reason, the ref on one day of a week just decides to call things in a completely different way than most refs would in 99% of the situations. But it does happen. And that is challenging for the athlete because now they don't really even know what rule set they're playing under because the rule set is kind of sort of variable. My brother, Matt, has referred to this factor as the referee variable, right? Where he talks about how, look, when you're preparing for a tournament, one of the things you might have to prepare for is just referee dynamics and referee variability. And, you have to have your mindset in a place where you can continue to function and be resilient if the ref screws you or if something goes in a completely wrong direction, because that does happen, unfortunately.
Yeah. And the unfortunate thing with ADCC is that you can't gain access to the rule book as a participant. So the only people who I think have access to the rule book are like the head referees. And so like ultimately, if they say something about the rules, it's like, okay, well, I have no means by which to contest what you're saying. Like, I have to take what you're saying on faith. So, yeah. Whereas IBJJF, you can read the rule book; it's online, which I definitely prefer that. But what are you gonna do?
Yeah, yeah. Well, hey, something that you wanted to talk about that's tangential to this, reefing on submissions and cranking submissions before you have positional control, right? Kind of a related conversation. We've seen a lot of discussion about that recently about, when is it okay to try to inflict damage instead of trying to establish control? I'd love to get your thoughts on that because that's something that's come up a lot in modern conversation here.
Yeah. So like there were two specific examples where people have had a lot to say on this. The first was Gianni Grippo versus Ellis Karadeg. That was a while ago. That was like the Gianni Rippo match. And then the second one was, obviously this is more recent, Pat Chigoli versus David Vieira at EBI. And people have gone crazy over this. Like the response to this match has been simultaneously disturbing and interesting. And I say disturbing because so the response has been like really fucked up in my opinion. Like, first of all, yeah, Pat is overweight. He's like a overweight teenager, right? And people have like been fucking like attacking his body and stuff. Like, and I don't know, like they're taking it to like this really weird area where it's like, okay, they're unhappy with what he did. And so that gives them like a blank check to just say whatever shit they feel like saying. Like, I don't know. People are calling him, I don't even want to say it. People are coming like, saying they really fucked up things about him, right?
Yeah. I actually, it's a good time to talk about this. I mean, admittedly, I'm tangentially aware of this. I am aware of the blowback. I saw the clip. I haven't really studied exactly how people have gone into the controversy, but I mean, this guy is not like Taylor Swift, right? He's not a household name. He's just a kid. And, right or wrong, and that's something that I'm sure you'll talk about in a second, but right or wrong, the fact that there's so many people have decided to basically dox this guy, chase him down and make him miserable. That's just a trend that I see a lot in online in general, but jiu-jitsu is no exception. I don't fucking like it. I don't like when people take umbrage to something that some guy did in a tournament, which, again, you can debate whether he should have done it or not, and we will. But I don't like the fact that now this is basically turned into a witch hunt on someone for something they did in a competition like this. I feel like, that is not an appropriate response, especially given that he's a minor, right? I mean, take the foot off the gas on this. I don't think we need to ruin this guy's life.
Yeah. And the thing about it is that it's a weird response too, because like, people act like this has never happened before. So anyway, let's talk about like the ethics of finishing a joint lock in a competition. Basically, the way I would say it is, and I'll explain this obviously, is don't hate the player, hate the game. And like at the end of the day, like this is something that I'm going to say something and then a lot of people will disagree with like, well, I know a professional grappler who doesn't agree with this. Okay, cool, great. Someone that disagrees. I don't even think they're telling you the truth. The reality is there is literally no professional grappler or full-time grappler or high-level competitor who will not, as soon as they get a joint lock, attempt to break someone. So I competed recently in Thailand, and in the first round match, I went against Dagestani guy, and I got a backside 50-50 heel hook, and ultimately I got the finish, and there was a pretty loud pop. Dagestani guys do not like tapping, so I hope there was no serious injury, but there might have been because he definitely took too long to tap. So people were saying, oh, it's okay that you popped him because you gave him time to tap. I don't know what that means. I did not give him time to tap. When I got the heel, I could have popped him within 0.2 seconds. I would have done it. right? And that goes for all high-level competitors. Literally no high-level competitor is concerned with, when I catch a heel, am I not going to fuck this guy up? Now, of course, if you're going against somebody who you know you are much better than, that's going to change, okay? So if I were to compete against, so in the second round matchup of that same tournament, I went against a guy who before the match, they were like, oh, he's a really, really good wrestler, but he doesn't know anything about leg locks. Whereas the first round matchup, the Dagestani guy, I'd actually seen him finish people with heel hooks. Okay, so in MMA fights. So I knew he had some leg lock knowledge, and they told me he was very resistant to tapping. So I knew I was going to have to put it on. Whereas the second guy, very good wrestler apparently, but didn't know anything about leg locks. As soon as I caught his heel, his coach started yelling at him to tap, and I actually gave him time to tap. But I didn't do that because I only did that because I was so sure he was going to tap. I'm like, okay, the coach is telling him to tap. I don't need to put this on. But if he did not tap, I 100% would have put it on. Now, I don't want to hurt anybody. I don't think most high-level competitors want to hurt anybody. In our perfect world, no one ever gets injured. But at the highest level of competition, people are not primarily concerned with the health and well-being of their opponents. We all go into these matches knowing ahead of time, this is a combat sport. Nobody wants to get hurt and nobody wants to hurt anyone else. But the game that we're playing involves joint locks as part of the game. You can't, unless you want to fundamentally change the nature of the sport, which I think that's a conversation I'm open to having, actually. It's an interesting conversation, like the ethics of even allowing joint locks. But unless you are willing to have that conversation about fundamentally changing the nature of the sport, you can't take out, when you catch something, people are going to blast it as quick and as hard as they can. And people will look at examples. For instance, they'll look at the match that I had against the Dagestani guy. Why did it take longer to get the pop than Pat did against the guy David? Because my guy defended way better. You know what I mean? He did the right things at first. Whereas David, he didn't do anything. He just lied there, or lay there, whatever, right? He just didn't do a fucking thing. So that's why it looked as gruesome as it did. When you look at something that's usually when you see one of these really quick, brutal finishes, first of all, it's honestly rarely as brutal as you think. So I could be mistaken, but I know for a fact. So Ellis Karadeg was not injured by Gianni Grippo, and everyone freaked out about that. There was no injury. And then and this is the thing I could be mistaken on. I don't think David was injured by Pat. He was hiking the next day. So that doesn't mean there was no injury. There was definitely probably a little bit of damage, but we're talking about significant injury. I don't think there was. There could be. I'm not saying there definitely wasn't, but I don't think necessarily that there was. And the other reason it looks so brutal is because there's such a big skill discrepancy here. Okay, Gianni and Ellis and Pat and David, at least in terms of leg locking, Pat is way better than David. I've rolled with Pat before, actually. I rolled with him 2 years ago when he was 14 or something. And the kid has always been one of the most dangerous leg lockers I've ever trained with. He's extremely impressive in that area, And so it's you're taking someone who's a hyper specialist, who's super good in that area, and you're putting him up against a guy who, I don't know, David Vieira, he's a black belt, so he's probably good, but you're in 50-50, that's Pat's area. And it's I've seen Pat fuck up really good 50-50 people in 50-50. So it's oh man, that's going to be a tough day for almost anyone. So it's there's a huge skill discrepancy there.
Yeah. Something that actually you of all people once said on this podcast was, I will never begrudge a competitor for doing what they need to do to win within the bounds of the rules. And that's how I look at the situation, right? I mean, I looked at the clip, and the first thing that I think is, did Pat do anything that is outside of what the rules permit? No, he didn't bite the guy. He didn't pull a gun on the guy, right? He didn't bring in his buddy and do a tag team on the guy. You can argue a few things about the way he attacked the heel hook, but you're not arguing about anything that's relevant based on the rules. Kind of a way I would think of it when we had Shanji Hibero on the podcast, he talked about this, and he talked about how there's competition jiu-jitsu and how that works. But then there's also this romanticized idea of jiu-jitsu. And in our head, what we all kind of in our hearts, we want this to be and we envision it to be based on the way it was sold to us when we all came in as white belts, right? The mythology about how the little guy can beat the bigger guy and position over submission and all of that. And that's all great. And I mean, yeah, I believe a lot of that stuff, but it's not a religion. There's no rule saying you have to play that way. If you get someone's leg and you don't want to sit there and go through various control positions and you just want to finish the fight right there, I mean, in the context of a competition, there's no rule at all saying you can't do that. It would be different, I suppose, if this guy were in a gym with a bunch of hobbyists and you were doing this to, a bunch of desk workers who don't know how to leg lock. That's maybe different. But in the context of a televised competition, he acted within the bounds of the rules, right? So I feel like when people are arguing this, they're not arguing based on what the rules say. They're arguing based on how in their head, this romantic idea of what they want jiu-jitsu to be, and they're attacking him based on that standard. But that's not the standard he was competing under. So what does it matter, really?
Yeah, so that's a really, really good point. I like that a lot. So when I think of this romantic notion of jiu-jitsu, someone who I think a lot about is Demian Maia, right? Like if you watch his MMA fights, there's like this really like cool sort of mystique about what he's doing where he's not really hurting people. He's just so good at, he'll take them down and then he chokes them out. He will punch people, but generally speaking, what he's doing is probably the gentlest way to fight somebody, right? And people love to say, oh, jiu-jitsu is the gentle art, right? And I think that this romantic notion is like, people like to imagine that their favorite grapplers, people who they think are like nice guys, it's almost like a soap opera. They go, oh, these guys are like the Obi-Wan Kenobi Jedi Knights of jiu-jitsu, right? They would never hurt
Oh,
anyone.
fuck, here we go.
No, I'm serious, dude. I'm not going to go deep into Star Wars. Don't worry. But it's like, they go like, oh, this guy would never hurt anybody, right? Oh, like this guy just wants to, win. And it's almost like, okay, I'll give you an example. Lachlan Giles is one of the most popular grapplers, right? And somebody posted on Reddit, I fucking loved this. It was so good. It was Lachlan in an interview saying that the second he gets a leg, he's trying to break you, which is what you should be doing. But then people are like, when Lachlan says that, they will make excuses for it. And it's okay when he says it. But when Pat did it, it's not okay. And then what I have to just come to that is, okay, so you're telling me that Lachlan is just ontologically good and Pat is just ontologically evil. Like, what is going on here, right? Like, they're doing the same thing. Lachlan said he's doing the same thing, right? Like, so in the case of Lachlan, it's okay to do it because by virtue of him being Lachlan, it's okay for him to do that. But because Pat is Pat, it is not okay for him to do that. Like Pat has been allocated to the role of evil bad guy, and Lachlan is Obi-Wan Kenobi, Jedi Knight, hero, good person, right? Like this is the comic book ridiculousness of what we're dealing with, right? Like rather than like, okay, both of these people are competitors and they're trying to win, right? Like I'm not denying that there are in sports sort of good guys and bad guys, right? Kind of like in a narrative sense when you want to watch it, right? But that's a construction of the fans. In the sport itself, very, very rarely at a high level is anyone concerned with anyone but themselves. And nor should they be. You're trying to fucking win. You know what I mean? Jiu-jitsu competitors are more like Boba Fett than they are like Obi-Wan Kenobi. Anyway, I'll leave it with the Star Wars references. Anyway.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because this, not the Star Wars thing, but just this general discussion, it reminds me of when you see this in MMA, right? I mean, I can think of numerous examples where stuff like this has happened. Probably one of the most obvious is when Frank Mir fought Nogueira, got him in a Kimura. Nogueira would not tap. I mean, what is Frank Mir supposed to do at that point? It becomes a game of chicken, right? If you're caught deep in a submission and you're refusing to tap, at that point, it's a game of chicken. You're basically you're giving your opponent two choices. Either let go because you don't want to hurt the person and potentially lose the fight that you came here to win, or finish the job, right? And within the purposes of the rules, the goal is not catch and release when you're competing, right? The goal is to get the tap and to win. And so it kind of is, if the other person is refusing to tap, they're kind of putting the attacker in this awkward position where what else are they going to do, right? This is what you have to do within the realm of the rule set. You should not be surprised that if you're stuck in a submission in a competition, the person's going to put braking pressure on you. That's why they came here. And yeah, of all of the things, it just does seem particularly unfair that a minor of all people is being singled out. I mean, you think of the perspective that this poor kid, granted, I don't know him. I mean, maybe he's a terrible person. I have no idea. I've never met Pat, but I can relate to being a young kid and having, people basically come after you like that. But man, when I was a kid, I never had the entire jiu-jitsu community shitting on me like they are on him. I don't feel good for that guy. I think it's unfair. And I think that a lot of adults honestly need to check themselves and ask why they think it's okay to treat a kid that way.
Yeah, well, like I said, I really think like without them realizing it, it has to do with this like designation of Pat as being ontologically evil by virtue of him being the bad guy. And like it's a combination of like fat shaming. Like people will fight this till they're blue in the face, but I definitely think there's an element of that. They're like, oh, he's a fat guy and he hurt somebody. He's evil, right? Like the bad guys in the movies, right? Jabba the Hutt is fat and Luke Skywalker's in shape, right? Like, so like, anyway, but like, so, and I want to talk about another point that a lot of people have said. They're like, this kid's the new Husamar Palhares. Okay. So you're telling me Pat, who has never held on to a submission after the tap, is comparable to someone who has broken people after they've tapped? Like, it's not the same thing, right? Like, if Pat had been holding on to that submission when the guy had tapped, yes, then that's a Palhares type situation. They're not comparable. The reason why what Palhares did, so it's like they look at a joint lock and they go, okay, joint locks are bad. I don't like that. That's really mean. Anyone who does that is mean. And it's like, no, hold on a minute. The reason why what Palhares did was wrong is because he didn't respect the tap. That it's not because he did a joint lock that is wrong. It's because he didn't respect the tap. So I think that there's actually, and I think that you'll be surprised to hear me say this, I think there's a very interesting conversation to be had about the wider ethics of joint locks, specifically leg locks in jiu-jitsu. I don't think it's as simple as just saying like, oh, just tap, or like, like we can flippantly dismiss the damage that's done with leg locks. And insofar as that is part of our sport, I do think you have to accept that there will be damage done, right? But I do think there's another really interesting conversation to be had about, is this something that a sport should have in it? So the way I see it is there's two ways to look at this. So if we might say, like, for instance, like imagine that there was a move, a joint lock, that if done would cripple if done to completion would cripple the opponent for life. I would definitely not want that move in sport jiu-jitsu. Okay. I don't care how effective that is. The consequences of it are just too fucked up. But in not allowing that joint lock in jiu-jitsu, you are opening up other grappling arts to take that skill, master it, and hypothetically like surpass jiu-jitsu in a certain area, because no one in jiu-jitsu is therefore equipped. If you've never seen a threat, you can't really defend well against it, right? So it's this balancing act, right? And that's kind of like, obviously, we don't have a spine lock like that, but with leg locks, right? You have this question of like, okay, if we allow this, we will have a disproportionate number of injuries from it. I don't believe, if you go and find podcasts past, I used to say stuff like, oh yeah, leg locks are just like any other joint lock. I actually don't think that anymore. I think that there is a certain degree in which they are more dangerous than other joint locks, because the knee and the leg in general is less dexterous than the arm, and there is less leeway. Okay. So I do not think that they are equally dangerous. I think leg locks are inherently more dangerous. There's greater damage done. The recovery is more difficult. There's less leeway, etc. Right. So I do believe these are inherently more dangerous locks. But if we ban them, the safety of the sport will increase. That's definitely true, I think. But if we ban them, we are then shackling jiu-jitsu athletes from being capable of understanding how these locks function. And then other grappling arts will not have this same concern for safety, and they will continue to perfect how these locks function. And then should the occasion arise that we ever compete, they're going to beat us with it, right? So it's a sort of that's an interesting philosophical debate there, right? Like, which do we take the side of pragmatism in, like, we want our art to be as functional as possible, so we allow these joy locks? Or do we take the side of, okay, we're going to have our art be a little less functional, but a little safer? And I tend to side on the practical side because I just want to know that jiu-jitsu is going to work. And I don't think they're so dangerous that there's no way to do them with any degree of safety. But I am empathetic to both sides of this debate. I can see like a debate like, should we allow, I would be very, very okay with banning all leg locks in lower level competition. Like a local Naga, I don't think a local, like an office desk worker should have to worry about never being able to walk again, you know what I mean, at a local Naga, right? Do you get what I'm saying?
100%, 100%. I mean, you know, I'm a hobbyist, so this is something I can relate to. And a big part of why I don't compete is because, look, I do jiu-jitsu not for glory. I do it for fun. I do it because I like to learn and I like the social aspect, right? The reason I don't compete is I'm just not willing to accept the risk of injury that comes along with that. And a lot of people do this professionally, or they prioritize the competitive aspect more than I do. And I certainly don't begrudge anyone for doing that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, when you go into that environment, especially when you've got a bunch of weekend warriors who have convinced themselves that they're samurai because they're blue belts, you get them in there and you give them tools like heel hooks. And yes, there is the possibility of damage being done. I'm generally not a huge fan of the idea of banning leg locks altogether. But one of the things that I do agree with on the IBJJF front is deferring some of the more damaging leg locks until the higher levels. I mean, toe holds terrify me even more than heel hooks. I mean, those two moves especially, there is a risk of serious, severe injury. And I'm personally not of the mind that, white belts and even blue belts should be trying to rip those off in local competitions to try to win. That's not to say they shouldn't be trained, but just I do think that the stakes are higher, right? It's one thing to pop your wrist or pop your elbow. It's another thing to tear your ACL. That can have life-altering consequences, especially for people who have a physical component to their job, right? If you have to pick up and move around a lot of heavy things, you can take away someone's livelihood doing that. I've talked about this on the podcast before. I think it's one thing if you're talking about high-level consenting professionals competing at a big stage, but I think that it is reasonable to put a bit more restriction on people who are competing at the casual and hobbyist level.
Yeah, so I definitely agree. And I just think that where I would like the conversation on this topic to go is less about so there was an article, I was asked to comment for it actually, and I did. It's on Jits Times, I think. They interviewed a bunch of high-level competitors, and they asked all of us, what do you think about the Pat situation? And every single competitor agreed with me. Literally none disagreed, because we all actually understand, I don't go into a match okay, I'll give you a really funny example of how people, you're fucked if you do, you're fucked if you don't. So at trials, I lost to Keith Krikorian in the round of 16. He got me with a heel hook in 50-50. And I tapped pretty much right away when he got me, because I was he's gonna get it. I'm not gonna get out. People were like, you tap really fast, you're a pussy. And I'm like, okay, so if you tap before you get fucked up, you're a pussy. But if I didn't tap and then Keith fucked me up, he's a sociopath. It's what, I did, I knew I was going to get fucked up if I didn't tap, right? So that's, in my opinion, I did the right thing given the situation. Yeah, I got fucking caught. That's what happens, bro. Keith is really good at heel hooks. He got me. And so I tapped. At that point, I think that we have to normalize tapping when you're people say that they're okay with it, but then at the same time, when people get tapped at a high level, people are in my opinion, there's almost no such thing as a tap that's too early. If you feel like you're fucked, and you should just tap.
Yeah. The way that I think of it, and I mean, especially as you get experienced, right? You know when you're in checkmate before the hammer comes down, right? Like you know you're done. There comes a point where it's just a matter of time. But there is this one weird thing about jiu-jitsu culture where we kind of expect people to basically fight until the last possible minute. That's not always productive though, right? Like there comes a time when you know, okay, there is a 99% chance that this is going to end in a devastating fashion for me if I don't put a stop to this right now. Part of being an experienced competitor or an experienced grappler is being able to detect when, look, okay, this is a really, really bad situation. And I don't understand why we fetishize, going down on your sword, basically. That doesn't really make sense to me that that's something that we punish people, like you said, if they strategically tap early to save themselves when they know they're not going to get out.
And it just like seems like weird to me when on the other side, like if the guy finishing the joint lock actually finishes the joint lock because the other guy didn't tap on time, now he's a sociopath and did something wrong. So it's like a weird thing. If we want, basically, as plainly as I would put it, is like if the sport is going to allow joint locks, then therefore you have to be okay with the unfortunate reality of the fact that joint locks sometimes lock joints, and like that's what the move's going to do, right?
It's one for the quote book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, hey, this is a good chat here, but I guess I would ask if we were to tie all of this up. I mean, we've had some interesting conversations here on really basically, okay, what can we do within the rules here? And why is it that some people have such a problem with people doing basically what they're allowed to do within the rules? I would say, if you've got your magic wand, you can change all of the federations to do whatever you think is right. What do you think is the right answer here in terms of how people can properly interpret these things? Like, okay, what is stalling? When can you crank on a submission? Are there any changes that you would suggest we make?
Okay, so I would do one thing in terms of rules to change stalling that probably would, like, I think a lot of people wouldn't like, but I think it would lead to better long-term outcomes, which would be that if there is body contact, you cannot give negative points for stalling. So like literally if they're touching each other, you cannot give negative points for stalling. I could maybe allow exceptions for if you're both standing and we've all seen those ADCC matches where you have two guys who are just like pushing each other for like 10 minutes and literally nothing happens. But in that case, both are stalling, right? But anyway, if you are in contact with someone physically, no negative points. Whereas if you're backing away for like 5 minutes, okay, you should probably get a negative point there. Like you're literally not doing anything. And as for joint locks, that one is, I think the joint lock situation is a lot trickier than the stalling situation. The stalling situation, I think, is as simple as understanding like what engagement is and rewarding, and rather I should say just not punishing people who are engaging. Whereas I think like the joint lock thing is like, there really is no perfect answer because you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't in terms of allowing them. I would say that generally how they exist is how I wouldn't change anything in the rules regarding joint locks. I would like if culturally we had a greater emphasis on like, okay, two things. If culturally it was more okay to just tap, right? Like just fucking tap, there's like that tournament in Thailand when I caught that Dagestani guy, it should have been culturally okay. Like the reason why he didn't tap, I would have to imagine is because in his mind, he's like, something about like looking down on tapping early, right? Like, dude, just fucking tap. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're better off tapping and going to train the next day. We're talking about a situation where the odds of you getting out are extremely, extremely low, So I would prefer if culturally it was more okay, let's just tap. I'm not saying don't ever try to escape. Maybe give it a shot or two, right? But after that, bro, it's done. Just fucking tap. And then if there was a greater emphasis in jiu-jitsu schools on like, basically on like leg lock knowledge in terms of like defense, right? So I think like leg locks they're spreading throughout the jiu-jitsu world pretty rapidly, right? Or that's been happening for a couple of years now. And I think that there's a lot more emphasis on offense than defense because offense is like, it's more exciting. I'd like if there was a little bit more emphasis on defense throughout the jiu-jitsu community, because I think that will increase the overall level of safety, right? If you know when you're done, when you're caught, that's going to come from understanding for understanding the defense. You'll know, okay, I'm not getting out, right? And then you can tap on time. So if we take these two cultural things, if we're going to allow joint locks in our sport, which is sort of as it currently exists, fundamental to jiu-jitsu, to sport jiu-jitsu, there's no rule change that can fix it. Like I've seen people propose, oh, what if we banned ripping joint locks? I don't even know what that means. Like,
yeah, how do you even do that, right? Like, because at that point, you're kind of getting into intent. Again, you're asking the ref to basically make a judgment on the intent of what the grappler is doing. And beyond that, you as the person attempting the submission cannot always control what the other person does, right? Sometimes the other person does something real stupid. and so it's kind of unfair to always put the blame on the attacker. So that would be kind of a weird thing to do.
Yeah, there's no way you could enforce that. It would be completely arbitrary. Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, what is too fast to finish a joint lock? It's like asking, it is literally like asking, oh, did Mike Tyson punch that guy too hard? Like, what? Like, what does that even mean? Like, that's the sport. That's what you're doing.
Yeah, it is really, really weird that we expect people in a competitive environment like that to also kind of like, okay, you want to win, but you don't want to try to win too hard. It is a weird expectation.
Yeah, it's weird. But yeah, so that's what I would suggest regarding those two topics.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for coming by again, Robert, and thanks for getting up early here for me. Any closing thoughts or things you wanted to share before we tie this one up?
No, I feel like I covered everything I wanted to regarding like both of these topics. Yeah, not really. I can't think of anything.
Awesome. Well, hey, let me ask you another question then. If people wanted to follow you or reach out to you or learn leg lock defense from you, how would they go about doing that?
So the best place would be my Instagram and my currently super inactive YouTube, which I promise I'm going to start putting stuff up on again. It's Robert Degle BJJ. So that's on. If you go to my Instagram too, there's a link in my bio to like my website where you can buy my instructionals. I have a couple leg lock defense instructionals and other things too. And a link to my YouTube channel where I have like a ton of free stuff. Eventually I will get back to putting stuff up again.
Awesome. And as I always do, I'll put the links to all of those things in the show notes. So if you want to check out Robert's Instagram, his YouTube, or pick up some of his instructionals, just pop open the show notes, go there, and I'll have the links right there for you. And of course, as always, I think all of our listeners know, but I got to plug my own premium service too. You can go to bjjmentalmodels.com to check it out. We've got tons of long form conversations on the premium site, much more in-depth course style, masterclass style lessons versus kind of the chats that we have here on the public side. You can also, if you're a premium member, you can send us your rolling footage. We'll break it down and get back to you. Really fantastic way to get good feedback from black belts around the world that probably you wouldn't otherwise have access to. So please do check that out if you haven't already. It floats the show. It's the reason you don't have advertisements on here is because people support us there. So please consider it. bjjmentalmodels.com to get signed up and you get a 7-day free trial. So thanks again for everyone who checks that out. And thanks, of course, to you, Robert. Always fun to have you by. And hey, yeah, I got to get you back at some point because I got to know, what did you think of Obi-Wan Kenobi? What do you think of Andor? You know, just the Star Wars machine rolls on and we can't just let that one drop.
For sure. And before I go, also on my Instagram, for the people who don't follow me or haven't been to my page yet, there's a great reason to go on right now. I show the secret technique that Royden Gracie used in ADCC 1997 in the finals to defeat, well, actually in the finals, but also all his other opponents. It was banned from the IBJJF and it was hidden by the Gracies, but I found a VHS tape here in Singapore labeled Gracie Secrets, wherein the secrets were disclosed, and now I'm making it known to the world. So
yeah, the legendary Horden Plata, I saw, a very, very secret technique. I heard is banned in many, many provinces in Brazil.
The Horden Plata. That's the name of the move from now until forever. That's the name.
Awesome. Well, yeah, do check that out. That is a sweet technique, though, I gotta say. Don't know if I'll ever hit it on anyone beyond a day one white belt, but it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, man. And of course, to everyone listening, thanks to you as well. Talk to you guys next time. Take care.